Okay. Good afternoon, everyone in Washington. Good evening to our viewers overseas, and good morning to people on the West Coast. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Institute Distinguished Fellow and head of the Koret Project on Arab-Israel Relations at the Washington Institute. It's good to have you back with us. We have a fascinating two-part panel today to look at a very fragile situation on the ground in the Middle East. Israel and Turkey have taken active postures to shape developments in post-Assad Syria. Ankara is backing the interim government's efforts for when it comes to security and governance and taking steps to deal with the Kurdish issue in the north. And Jerusalem has continued some cross-border military campaign measures that began months ago. These two sets of developments could impact the fragile transition going on in Syria. And we want to look at does it have an impact for an effort for an inclusive, non-sectarian governance? Could it perpetuate conflict? And really, will Syria become a fault line in U.S.-Israel relations with these two allies, or can they reconcile their conflicting policies and find a path towards dialogue and peace? So to discuss this, we are delighted to do this two-part policy forum. The first part is going to be with Maya Gebeily, who will examine on the ground developments in Syria. And then we will discuss a second part after Maya that will look more at from Israeli and Turkish angles. Maya is the Reuters bureau chief for not just one country, but for three, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. She's currently based in Beirut. This discussion is with her in Beirut now, but she has spent a lot of time on the ground in Damascus and in different parts of Syria. She has previously worked as a reporter for the AFP, including in Baghdad and Beirut. And so, Maya, welcome to the Washington Institute.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David.
Delighted to be with you. So I think first question, just an update on how you see Israeli and Turkish involvement in Syria, how it feels on the ground. How do you assess the development of the IDF campaign in Syria now?
Sure, yeah. But we've seen both of those dynamics really develop over the last, it's been 4 months now since Assad fell, essentially exactly 4 months. And we had the opportunity, the Reuters team had the opportunity to head straight into Damascus on the first day, right on the 8th of December, just hours after Assad had fled Damascus to the coast. And so we've been able kind of month by month to track these different developments and to see how they've been evolving. And I think the Turkish involvement has been obviously something that many of us have been looking at for a very long time in terms of support to various political and armed opposition groups inside Syria. So I think, and even as the U.S. president has acknowledged, essentially Turkey is seen as the really big winner in terms of the developments post-Assad. What we get from the ground is a sense that they're obviously very keen to be involved at the political and military and economic levels. So it's not just about the defense pact, which we have reported on for the past couple of months. Turkey's very keen to put together a defense pact with the new Syrian military that's being developed, that would involve training, that would involve some serious Turkish deployment at Syrian bases, and we can talk about that later because that's really where it comes up against Israeli interests. But we've also seen how interested they are in making sure that this political project works. So this is something that Turkey has a stake in. It wants to see a stable Syria. It wants to see a centralized Syria. And they've kind of repeated that in their messages, obviously publicly, but also behind the scenes, which we can get into a little bit later as well. But they don't want to do that on their own. And so from Damascus, we see very much how they want to create a coalition. They want Gulf countries sitting at the table. They want everybody to kind of share that collective goal of seeing the Syrian administration succeed. And I think the feeling is very much that this may not be the ideal person that they would want sitting in Damascus, but it's who they have, and they want to see this Syrian administration succeed so that it doesn't fall apart into further conflict, into further destabilization that would obviously impact Syria's neighboring countries. So again, in terms of kind of main landmarks that we're looking for, I think the Defense Pact is the main one that will tell us a lot about what Turkey's role is going to look like on the ground across Syria. And they're interested in seeing, the thousands of Turkish troops that are already based in northern Syria to have a kind of bigger geographic spread where they'd like to be deployed, and eventually, to have economic development again with Gulf partners, and to see that kind of stabilize for the good of the region. That's from the Turkish perspective. In terms of the Israeli involvement, I mean, again, we were there the first couple of days, and in the first 48 hours after Assad fell, there were hundreds of Israeli strikes across Syrian territory. It was really the most widespread episode of bombing that we had seen from the Israeli Air Force onto Syria. I was in Damascus when those strikes hit, and it was just, we were all woken up by this successive booms very, very early in the morning and kind of repeated throughout the days that followed. And of course, we've seen, as you said, the IDF carry out, not just incursions, but I mean, increasingly kind of pushing into Syrian territory and staying there. And they've said quite publicly that they intend to create a demilitarized zone. So increasingly, those two dynamics are coming up against each other. And this is what our reporting has focused on in the past couple of months, is how these different postures and how these different aims for these two major militaries in the region are starting to come up against each other. And we can get in, obviously, in the later questions, get into what that means for Syrians and how they're reacting to that kind of looming showdown.
What do you think? And by the way, just for our viewers who are watching this on Zoom, if you have questions, you know how to go to the bottom of your screen to ask your question in the Q&A function. And if you're watching this on YouTube or on the Washington Institute website, just go to Policy Forum at washingtoninstitute.org to ask your question. We'll try to get in what we can, given limitations of time. But Maya, what do you sense with local communities? There's been a lot of attention here, I think, on how you see the Druze community, or how do you see the Kurds reacting? Again, this is a session not per se, there's been a lot of sessions on the new Syria, but as they relate to this issue of Turkey in the north and Israel in the south.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have, obviously, as you've noted, a very, very diverse Syrian population where over the course of the past 14 years, they've been really deeply divided on a lot of the geopolitics that has kind of injected itself into the Syrian conflict. I think overall from Syrians in Damascus and Syrians in the south, we're obviously getting a lot of growing anxiety and fear and anger at Israel strikes in Syrian territory, especially as time moves on and those strikes and those incursions seem to just intensify. I think there was an initial sense of when Assad fell, okay, we understand that the Israelis want to eliminate any possible military threat that could emerge out of this chaos. But since then, I think what Syrians feel and what I get from Syrian officials as well is this feeling of, we've really tried to bend over backwards to signal to the Israelis that we don't want to pose a threat to them. And so as these strikes have persisted and as those incursions have also kind of gone deeper and deeper into Syrian territory, and obviously we saw last week the deepest incursion that left 9 Syrians killed, that anger has been rising. It's essentially this sense of, well, what exactly did we do to deserve this new destabilizing factor? So that's what we're hearing from the Syrians in terms of people talking. And then officials in Damascus have stressed also quite publicly. And Shada said, I asked him a question in a press conference a couple of months ago, and he about Israel's incursions, and he said, we want Israel to abide by the 1974 disengagement agreement. We've called on Israeli troops to respect those boundaries, and we're asking Qatar, he was speaking alongside the Qatari Prime Minister, we asked Qatar to help us, mediate that outcome. I think, my perception then was that he was choosing his words very carefully. He did not say, for example, Zionist entity. He did not say occupation. He was choosing his words very carefully, I think very deliberately, and has been doing so for the past couple of months to signal to Israeli leaders that Syria is not going to pose a threat. And behind the scenes, they're also reaching out to their allies, and we've reported as well that Ahmed al-Shara and that the interim president and that the foreign minister as well, Asad al-Shibani, have asked Turkish leaders who were in Damascus just last month to relay to Washington in particular that Syria is not going to pose a threat to anyone's interest, not to the Israelis, not to the US. And I think overall the perspective is, Shara has a very, very long to-do list, including a lot of very thorny issues that he needs to address on the security front, including foreign fighters, including making sure that command and control is very much unified across his very diverse kind of smattering of armed groups that he has to bring under his control. And the idea is that more Israeli strikes, deeper Israeli incursions, the insistence on a demilitarized zone in the south where his forces would be barred from exerting their own authority, that just makes all of the other very complicated issues that he needs to address that much harder.
I saw that Foreign Minister Fidan of Turkey at a NATO meeting, I think on April 4th in Brussels, said, we're not looking for a confrontation with Israel and Syria. And I've seen some scattered reports that are unconfirmed about some sort of, I don't know, Turkish-Israeli deconfliction in Syria. I just came back from a trip there and was struck by how the issue of Syria is so front and center. And part of it there, I feel, is there's an October 7th overlay, a feeling that there was no buffer zones, and then Israel was hit by Hamas on October 7th. There was, Islamists like Sinwar who said, "Oh, I'm not the Islamic Jihad," or I could think about a Hudna truce, and yet, he then there was October 7th. So I do sense coming from Israel this trauma of October 7th is having an impact on how Israel sees Shara at this time. Now that could evolve as understandings deepen, but do you think there's any understanding in Syria about the impact of October 7th in Israeli thinking about Syria?
I mean, I think a lot of Syrians, including obviously the ones that are in power now in Damascus, have watched everything unfold over the last year and a half, but are not looking at that as a vacuum. So they're not looking at October 7th as a vacuum. They're not looking what's unfolded in Gaza, obviously, with Israel's military campaign there in a vacuum. They're looking at it in the context of also the last 14 years of war that they've experienced, and they're trying to prioritize how they can keep their country together in a very, very complicated regional scene. I think, that they're not just kind of looking at October 7th, but they're looking at, Israel's military campaign in Gaza afterwards and what the international community has been able to do and what it's not been able to do. And they're hoping that, Israel's military campaign in Syria will not lead to the amount of destabilization, destruction, death, and obviously displacement that Israel's campaign has led to. So they're kind of looking at it in the whole picture, and they're in a very tough position. Again, Shara, his history in Idlib and the way that he's tried to kind of consolidate security control over various pockets of Syria over the last, I'd say, half a decade. What he has to do now is he has to be able to kind of replicate that across all of Syria with a lot of different actors at play, with a lot of different interests intermingling. And I think he understands very well, and the impression that we've gotten. I mean, we interviewed him in Damascus about a month ago. Your reference to that NATO summit in Brussels, that was my colleague Samia Nahoud who interviewed him as well there. And so we've had a lot of kind of FaceTime with the Syrians and with the Turks. And the sense that we get very much is that they're doing their utmost in a very sensitive regional atmosphere right now to signal to the Israelis that this is not, we do not pose a threat and we do not intend to pose a threat. I think it would be very hard for him to make that message publicly. It would be nearly impossible. It's something that I think, in the regional atmosphere, he can't do. But from the Syrian perspective, they've really done everything they can to make sure those signals are getting across. And so that's why I think there's a lot of concern about the expanding Israeli military operations in the south.
Judging from what you're saying about the strikes and all, do you feel that the Israeli strikes have actually helped strengthen ties between the Turks and the Syrians as a result?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a little bit of that. We've heard a little bit of that in Damascus. This sense that, Shaddad really has nowhere else to turn if he wants to keep himself to have some kind of a buffer between himself and, any expanding Israeli operations, that he really needs to cling on harder to the Turks. We've heard that more as a as a position of analysis than as a kind of fact of how he's thinking and how he's approaching this. But I think really what they're doing is they're leaning on this international agreement. I mean, there is a now it's more than 50 years old. It's a 51-year-old agreement with UN observers in this demilitarized zone, and that was supposed to be the guarantee. And so he's leaning on that. I mean, I think, from his stance, he's trying to be pragmatic and show that he understands international resolutions, etc. So he's leaning on that as, I'm not. He hasn't said anything about trying to liberate Palestine or anything like that. So his kind of strict statements related to the 1974 disengagement agreement, getting the Qataris to mediate, getting other kind of countries to really pass on to the Israelis that he doesn't intend to pose a threat. That's where his head's at.
What about also, if I can ask you, just if there's a Gulf angle, do you think the Gulf could have an impact on lowering tensions between Syria and Israel, between lowering tensions, but what's emerging is a sphere of influence like situation,
Mhm.
essentially. I mean, MBS in Saudi Arabia is, on one hand, we feel he's always tried to, distance himself from some of these regional hotspots as he focuses domestically on Vision 2030, NEOM, and things like that. And yet, a Lebanese analyst friend said to me, I think he's trying to talk to the Turks and to lower the temperature. He's concerned about that things could intensify in a way that would be a role model, might even intimidate Jordan next door. So I'm just trying to think if you see external actors having an impact in a favorable way, and then connected to that, the ultimate, I mean, from where we're sitting in Washington, is the United States. When Donald Trump is sitting in the Oval Office with Bibi Netanyahu and is saying, "I know Erdogan well. I think we could solve any problem." I'm curious how you see that. As he said, as long as people are reasonable,
Right.
how you see that going down. What ways are there to try to lower the tensions? What role could external actors play?
I mean, I think your first question was is there a Gulf angle? And there's always a Gulf angle. I think fundamentally one of the very first things that we heard going into Damascus that first week was we need Gulf support, and we need it to be unified to the highest extent possible, and we need there to be engagement from the Gulf, just like there's engagement in Turkey. I think it has seemed to us, again, from conversations on the ground and also conversations with a lot of very close Syria watchers, that there's a perception that this can't work if it's one country's problem. So it wouldn't be workable if Turkey kind of has to deal with the whole basket of Syrian issues on its own, or if, let's say, Qatar has to deal with the whole basket of Syrian issues on their own. I think there's an idea that different countries can play different roles in terms of security, in terms of economic revival, etc. And we've seen different countries, start to get together, have these conversations, whether it's in Saudi, whether it's in Qatar, whether it's the GCC, whether it's other summits. So that those conversations are happening. I think what we've seen repeatedly is that any conversations that have to do with economic revival for Syria, which is increasingly you know could become a security problem if we don't see at least a modest improvement in the economic situation for Syrians. The wall that everyone keeps running up against is obviously the very serious American sanctions regime that exists on Syria. I mean, we reported a couple of weeks ago that the Qataris were keen to support Syria with funds to be able to pay public sector salaries at an increase, to increase public sector salaries and make sure that they're paid out, and then they have to kind of walk back from that because of U.S. sanctions that remain in place, despite the kind of the partial reprieve for 6 months that will run out in July. But again, I think the interesting dynamic that we've seen now is that we have a State Department to-do list essentially for Syria that was handed to Syria's foreign minister that has several key points related to cooperation on counterterrorism, related to eliminating any foreign fighters in senior military roles, related to helping with uncovering the fate of Austin Tice, of course. And so there's a list, at least now, that the Syrians feel like they have, and if they complete essentially those tasks, they can possibly hope for some partial sanctions relief at the end of that. So we've been trying to report on America's policy towards Syria for the past couple of months. It's been quite difficult because we've seen, and I think it's no secret to anyone listening in Washington that there's a pretty big divide on how to approach Syria, on whether this guy, whether Ahmed al-Shara should be seen as the Al-Qaeda terrorist that he once was, and we should just stick with that perception of him, or if we should think about, someone that we need to engage with, at least for the good of regional security. And so at least, that checklist that Syria now has to accomplish at least gives us an indication of how the US could be engaging moving forward, and the idea that Washington and the president in particular would be open to helping to mediate, what would be a really massive regional showdown between Turkey and Israel in Syria. That also at least has given some kind of sense to a lot of Syrians that, okay, maybe there is actually some kind of global interest in what's happening here, and that the US could kind of, again, play a major role in what the security situation looks like.
There's been, I want to ask you about another external actor in Syria,
Sure.
Apart from the Gulf and the United States, and that is Russia. The issue of their bases. And, we've seen reports even that Israel favors maintaining Russian bases in Syria as a check on the Turks. That is a real shift. I'm just curious how you see the Russian role at this time. How do you see them?
Yeah, it was an interesting question right off the bat, because I think when we saw Assad flee to Russia, when he left, first he fled to a Russian-operated base in Syria, and then from there he was evacuated to Russia. That was the first question that we had was, what kind of role is Russia going to play in this remade Syria, or the Syria that is still being remade? When we asked President Shara in our interview about the fate of these bases, he said that his forces, as they were kind of approaching Damascus, they were very deliberate not to target Russian bases or Russian kind of troops and contingents, because they wanted to keep the door open to have a dialogue with Russia moving forward. So again, he was, I think he was thinking in a pragmatic way. I can't exactly alienate a permanent UN Security Council member. I want fewer enemies than I've had for the past 10 years. So let me try to approach this strategically. So I think those relationships are they're talking about the fate of the bases. The sense that we get is that they will probably stay. What role Russia plays kind of in the entire Syrian security framework moving forward in terms of relationships, military to military relationships, trainings, the extent to which they would have, an air force, what size that would be. I think those are still details that have to be worked out, and in particular, if the new Syrian authorities are working out those same details with the Turks, it just makes it that much more complicated to see where Russia's military role fits in.
Do you see Shara, the people with him in HTS? How is there a way to discern, as a journalist, to the extent of his grip internally on his own people? And because it has implications also for how Turkey and Israel are bound to look at the situation. How much do you see that how much has he consolidated his authority from your perspective?
This was we had started to see early on I'm trying to remember when I was there. It was when I was there in late January, in Damascus in late January, we started to hear reports from residents of the city, in particular from minorities, people that lived in Christian neighborhoods, people that operated bars, etc., that, there were armed kind of groups of men coming around and either, trying to convert them to Islam or trying to shut down their bars, etc. So the first sense that we got was that, they're actually, even in January, they weren't really in full control of the kind of security situation. What really blew it open, obviously, was the events of the coast, in which hundreds of Alawite civilians were killed, and that was a mobilization of armed forces in retaliation for a kind of attack by pro-Assad loyalists that had kind of retreated to the coast, that were still there, and they carried out an ambush, and they killed several of the new Syrian security forces. The issue with that is that it was such a widespread retaliation. I mean, there were, and my colleagues and I documented, calls from Aleppo, calls to jihad that were ringing out from mosques in Damascus, and this kind of very widespread security mobilization all across Syria that ended with thousands of fighters descending on the coast, and carrying out these really horrific atrocities. So what really kind of blew the lid open on that and really showed that he's not in full control of his forces were those events. And he actually, in his interview with us, also kind of alluded to that and said there were a lot of while he wouldn't specifically say whether any members of his new defense ministry were involved in the killings, he did say that there were fighters that descended on the coast without authorization from the Syrian defense ministry, and that's something that he still has to work through. Again, this is for 14 years of war, and I think many people who'd worked on Syria and who've looked at Syria for the last decade know how every previous attempt to kind of create a unified body to oppose Assad, a unified kind of military structure to oppose Assad, failed repeatedly over the course of those 14 years. So I think Sharaf feels the pressure. I think he knows that this is a very difficult task ahead that he has to do, that hasn't worked in the past 14 years, and now he has to do it, and the stakes are very high. But I think those negotiations are ongoing, and they're trying to see how to make sure everybody falls under one structure.
Maya, this is extraordinary. I want to thank you very much for your time and perspective, your insight, on the ground reporting and looking at these historic months after a regime that we've all known for decades suddenly has crumbled, and now what comes in its wake. So I just want to thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. And stay safe in Beirut. And then I hope you join us, stick with us for a moment, because we're going to come now to the second half of our panel discussion on Israeli and Turkish perspectives. So, but thank you, Maya, for your time. All the best. Bye-bye. Okay. All right. So that was a fascinating conversation we just had. And now we're going to go to part 2 of our discussion on this virtual policy forum. And we're going to be joined by 2 people who are well known to the Washington Institute world, and that is Soner Cagaptay and Assaf Orion. Soner is the Bayer Family Senior Fellow, Director of our Turkish Research Program at the Washington Institute. He's the author of many books, monographs, including the most recent paper, Building on Momentum in U.S.-Turkey Relations. And Assaf is the Liz and Moni Reuven International Fellow with the Washington Institute, and is also a Senior Research Fellow at Israel's Institute for National Security Studies, INSS, and he's the former head of the IDF Strategic Planning Division. So as we get into it, maybe I can also just ask our two panelists who saw this on the screen, maybe just to say what impressed them, each of you, about what you heard. Assaf, you want to start?
I think it's a very interesting story in which each party looks at things a bit differently, coming from different perspectives, different angles, and different tools. And the potential for conflict of interest becoming a conflict of militaries is clear. And I think that's the most important part. But there are also hints and materials which allow for opportunities to calm down and find arrangements, I think, as we can explore down the road.
So
Sure, if I can jump in, and it's great to be on the same panel with you and Assaf. You know, in an ideal world, Turkey and Israel should be thankful to each other, but we're seeing the opposite: escalation of tensions and risk of military conflict. Why should they be thankful? Israel destroyed Hezbollah, much of its infrastructure. Hezbollah was acting as a Praetorian Guard to the Assad regime, especially in northern Syria, abutting Turkey. The end of Hezbollah's presence in the north allowed for Turkish-backed forces, but also HTS, to basically bulldoze way into Damascus in less than 2 weeks. So in an ideal world, as a result of these developments, of course, Iran has been kicked out of Syria for the first time in 1979, which is very significant for Israeli security. So in an ideal world, Israelis and Turks would be thankful to each other, saying, thank you, no, thank you for doing this favor, but they're not doing this. They're rather escalating tensions. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Israel and Turkey view Syria's future very differently. Turkey wants to quickly re-centralize it. It's because Turkey has decided that a decentralized Syria produces security threats to it. Sub-state actors, ISIS and PKK and YPG, Kurdish groups have used kind of Syria's re-centralized landscape to carry out attacks into Turkey. Turkey wants to quickly re-centralize it, and it looks like this has to happen under HTS. And in the long term, Turkey wants to flip Syria into an ally. And I guess for the Israelis, quick re-centralization and Turkey becoming an Israeli ally are both undesired. So I think the views of Israel in the short term and the long term are not aligned when you look at it from Ankara or Jerusalem.
I think you both make some important points. I think, we forget that things are moving at such a rapid pace. We haven't always digested what has just occurred. And Soner, I think the fact that you mentioned that Israel and Turkey, are both happy the Assad regime is gone. There's no nostalgia in either country.
Zero.
Right, for Assad. And for Iran, using it as a land bridge to bring weaponry into Hezbollah overland through Syria. And we've forgotten the fact that this is what has united them, that we've gone already to the next phase of, well, what could divide them? And maybe you, Assaf, you could relate to it. Look, I just came from Israel, and I was struck by how what I call the spheres of influence school seems so dominant these days in Israel, believing that benchmarks for Syria of a centralized state, there's a lot of skepticism. And when I was trying to ask Maya, some of it seemed to me an overlay of October 7th, a belief that buffer zones are more important than they used to be, given what happened cross-border with Hamas. Second, what I call the Sinwar syndrome, this belief that, there could be some Islamist who says nice things. Oh, I might want a hudna, a truce, or I'm not going to join the Guardian of the Walls in 2021 with the Islamic Jihad, only to be shocked by October 7th. So, and then I think certainly on the Israel piece, and Assaf, you correct me, but I sense that Israelis don't think Trump is long for this world when it comes to U.S. forces in Syria, and he's not going to fight with Erdogan. And I do wonder, if taking all that together, how Israel is becoming more skeptical. And I think certain things Trump has said to Netanyahu about, well, maybe, reportedly, and I've asked this to several people, like, well, why don't you and Erdogan kind of split it? that seems to have reinforced the spheres of influence schools. So I don't know, Assaf, I'm just curious, when we look at end states, how, what is Israel hoping will be this end state as you see it?
In a long view, taking the long view, I think Israel's current policy stems from three interesting sources. One is the historical perceived threats and how to counter them. We can discuss how they evolved over the generations. Second is post-October 7th trauma. You immediately see the footprint of those. And the third, contradictory in some way, is a sense of a great power, opportunity, and no one can stop us. I think the mixture of those contradicting elements is what we see at play. So against the threats, Israel wants to prevent threats to its borders and its border communities. It wants to counter emerging threats at depth, like ballistic, air, or proxy and militia elements. And of course, the logistical aspect that you mentioned, that Syria is a conduit to Lebanon or to other places. So he doesn't want to see entrenchment. He doesn't want to see emergence of threatening forces. In the past, it was the Syrian armed forces as the mainstay of threats since the peace with Egypt in 1982. Then it became Iran and the Axis, including Hezbollah and so on, along with ISIS and the jihadis. So at the time, if I need to recall our discussions in the beginning of the last decade, the discussion was what's better for us, the devil we know, the Assad, or the chaos and all sorts of threats from Syria. Now I think we see a new incarnation of that concept, because Israel did something like a copy-paste between Iran and the proxies and Turkey and HTS or the other jihadis. So I think without spending enough time on the differences between those two, Israel is applying its knee-jerk strategy to that problem. So I think Israel can live with an effective centralist regime, which we don't see in the cards, but it's Turkey's goal, as we heard. It can also work with a weaker regime with spheres of influence, and I think we're along that point. Operationally, it means, yes, you need a deeper buffer between the communities and possible threats from the east. And I think Minister of Defense Katz said, we want 15 kilometers deep buffer, and then 65 area of influence, which is together 80. That recalls the number of the depth to which the Russians should have distanced the forces back in 2018 when the regime was back. So one is the buffer forward. Second is demilitarizing the south of Damascus. So there won't be elements of threats there. And beside that, Israel is preempting and preventing emerging threats that it perceives. It's not only military assets. As we heard, Israel bombarded most of the Assad regime arsenal before it could fall into somebody else's hands. But it also keeps on going in that sense against those military assets. Another interesting element is the cross-border cooperation and outreach, both to cross-border communities, Sunni, Druze, otherwise, but in a deeper sense to the Druze in general in the south, and possibly to the Kurds in the north. The most interesting thing that Israel said recently is that it might envision something like the South Lebanon army being a Druze militia. That tells us at least about the sources of inspiration applied to nowadays Syria.
So I want to ask Soner, which is Soner. I mean, given what you just heard from Assaf, I mean, almost, there's a danger here of what he called cut and paste, that to try to say there was an Iranian proxy network, now it's a Turkish proxy network, and we know how Israel sees Iran. How do you avoid this? I mean, I saw Fidan's remarks in NATO and Brussels saying we're not looking for confrontation. Do you think that Israel and Turkey can find a way to deconflict in Syria?
Absolutely. And it's actually interesting and speaks to the policy influence of the Washington Institute that after we sent out the invite for this panel, suggesting that there could and should be a US role in mediating and deconflicting, it looks like President Trump has decided to step in. Joking, of course. But there is, I think, a vision in the White House and the administration that maybe Turks and Israelis cannot figure this out themselves because there's not much trust between principals, Erdogan and Netanyahu, bureaucracies, and populations, which is quite a big change if you look at the historic trajectory of Turkish-Israeli ties. Israelis consider Turkey their second best ally in the late 20th century, and Turkey similarly embraced Israel. That's now gone. And I think that's why US role is maybe quite necessary, and it looks like that deconflicting is happening. The press is reporting. I think that's significant. I think, David, we have crossed the threshold of potential military conflict, but it doesn't mean the issue has been hashed out because the positions are still quite far apart. For Turkey, I think re-centralizing Syria, as I said earlier, is a priority, not only because Ankara wants to end the country's decentralization, which has produced security threats, but also always following Europe and not wanting to be left behind. Turkey now has its own versions of anti-immigrant, anti-refugee parties. And these are big challenges even for President Erdogan to manage, given that Turkey has 4 million Syrian refugees that constituted nearly 5% addition to Turkey's population of 85 million people. If Syria stabilized, some of them would go back. It would lift the burden of Turkey's economy, which has not been doing well. But in the long term, I think Turkey wants to flip it, and maybe that comes to Assad's explanation of how Israelis see Turkey's role. Turkey wants to flip Syria from being its most problematic neighbor historically to its probably strongest ally among its neighbors. Now, that might be surprising because a lot of people, if you ask them, including listeners and viewers on this panel, who's Turkey's most problematic neighbor, they would say it's Greece. It's not the case. Turkish-Greek ties were excellent for much of 20th century after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire until the Cyprus issue blew up. Not the case for Turkish-Syrian ties. I did my doctoral research on Turkey in the interwar period. Interwar Syria under French mandate was a hub of all sorts of anti-Turkish groups, Armenians, Kurds, those who wanted to restore the caliphate. After the end of World War II, when Syria joined the Soviet bloc, the Middle East version of the Iron Curtain emerged in Turkish-Syrian border. And this is a porous border. Much of it has no natural barriers. The PKK used this border to carry attacks into Turkey. Then, of course, when the Syrian war started, this time anti-Assad rebels used the porous to carry attacks into Syria from the other side of the border. Turkey wants to end all these historic trends and consolidate HTS's rule, but also flip Syria into ally. I think Israelis are looking at this and saying, that's not good for us, because a Turkey that has influence 20 kilometers from the Israeli border or miles under Erdogan is a threat. Is it really a threat? And that's perhaps a long answer to your short question is, I think Turkey and Iran are very different in the way they look at Israel. Iran wants to destroy Israel. It wants to eliminate it. Turkey under Erdogan, I think at the moment, despite the very negative nature of the relationship, hasn't cut ties with Israel. It has sanctioned it, but it's not the same. And it shows to me something that Erdogan, because I guess he grew up in 20th century Kemalist Turkey, understands the value of maintaining ties with Israel. If Turkey is going to be a regional player, it has to be able to call all capitals. That's why I think he's not going to rupture with Israelis. And also for him to be a global player, including having kind of a line of communication with President Trump. He understands the importance of ties with Israel. So I think if the Israelis maybe instead of copy and pasting Iran's presence and Turkey's presence and Iran's presence and seeing one threat gone, another threat is arriving, maybe took a kind of a more sanguine view of Turkish presence. The conclusion is, I can see how Erdogan, if Turkish-Israeli ties in Syria stabilize, how Erdogan brings forward Syrian recognition of Israel to the table, which could be a game changer for Israel's northern front. Because ultimately, as I said, Turkey looks at Israel very differently than other countries in the region, such as Iran, and there'll be a huge peace dividend for Israel. But to get there, I think we still need to hash out the differences of deconfliction zones and zones of influence and what each side will commit to the process going forward. But I feel like we have passed the threshold of potential conflict. That was probably last week, so that's really good news.
So if you feel like listening to what you're saying, and then I want to hear what Assaf thinks, but so Nair, just to follow that up, like if, I don't know, if you were to give advice to President Trump and saying, here's how you could help deconflict between the two, what would your advice be? And you have to admit that I think that Erdogan's statement calling for the destruction of Zionism is not exactly a confidence building measure.
It's not.
And Israelis after October 7th, they hear that, I think, even with a different ear, in a way that they just have learned to say, look, what these people say to their own public does matter. It is consequential. So what would be your advice to ratchet this down? And are you taking spheres of influence as a given, even if the Syrian ultimate goal is a centralized government?
Yeah. So my advice to President Trump would be, I guess, based on how the principles of Turkey and Israel view him. I can't decide sometimes if Trump likes Erdogan more or Bibi more. And similarly, I think both leaders empathize and politically feel that they have a good connection with the US president. Right. So that allows for, in my view, a détente that the US can impose, number one, perhaps through presidential channels, on Turkey and Israel to say, I have other global issues to worry about, such as China, trade wars, tariffs, Ukraine war. Please don't fight. You don't need to get along right away. And I think that also suggests you can start deconflicting. I think deconfliction has started. Whether we end up with spheres of influence will depend on, I guess, how events in Syria evolve. Israel wants to see spheres of influence emerge. Turkey wants to see no spheres of influence, completely centralized country. I think we could end up with a solution which can be hashed out behind closed doors, where Syria is centralized, but Israel has the right to strike at targets through kind of consultation with the Turks and the US, if it sees these targets as being imminent, without the demarcation of formal spheres of influence. Ultimately, I think that Syria is on a track where it is going to be less of a threat to Israel going forward than it was before. I can understand how Israel sees the Sinwar threat there. You know, HTS builds an infrastructure and uses there in the long term to attack Israel. But I think the other trajectory where Erdogan, if Turkish-Israeli ties are deconflicted in Syria, Erdogan can bring on board Syria's recognition of Israel in the long term is a huge dividend for the region.
Assaf, and how do you see it? What advice would you give to President Trump to deconflict between these countries?
You know, regardless of the question of whether President Trump listens to our advice, I can try to, you know, address the hot points and minefields that should be avoided. I don't think that Israel is looking for a sphere of influence per se. I think Israel's interest in Syrian politics is very low. I would say this is a monovision looking at weapon systems and possible threats. Now, this allows for functional understandings, and we need those understandings with both the Syrian regime and with Turkey. We need to be able to collectively work against Iran and Hezbollah's efforts to return. Now, think about Lebanon as a source of inspiration. Sometimes you can inform your frenemies that something bad is happening and they will deal with it. And if it doesn't work, you can strike it. we need to understand the sensitivity of Israel to its freedom of action there. We need to be able to take out threats. This means that if there are ideas in Turkey of putting air defenses into Syria, let's think about how Russia did it. With Russia, it was pretty clear that you may hold SAM systems, but if you lock it on our aircraft, we will destroy you. So there need to be some understanding about the rules of conduct, about who is where, about where Turkish forces are not going beyond good connectivity and channels, even between air command posts, like we had with Hamimim. And we still do have those. We need some new framework for security arrangements in the Golan, because 74 is a Cold War paradigm. It's for standing armies. It's meant to prevent 1973. This is a bygone problem. We need to update it. The depth is different. The weapon systems are different. The enforcement or monitoring system is different. I think there's a new opportunity to mold something new. A good advice that both sides should avoid inflammatory statements like that. Oh, Israel should be wiped off the map, like the Iranians do. Or Allah, can you please help us destroy Israel, as Erdogan said. Or the Turkish army can reach Tel Aviv within 72 hours. Well, good luck. These are not confidence and trust building measures. We should go back to some other kind of communication. And the US role also has, beyond the presidential level, a military level. Even if it's a token force and it causes other parties to think twice about things they're doing, saying we will not accept this and that, so avoid undesirable activities. That's something that the US can do at a very low cost, relatively speaking. And I think we need to keep Russia out as much as possible and keep Qatar in a limited role if we can.
All right, I want to give Sonia a chance to get in on this, but I just want to be clear on what you're saying, because the issue of Turkish air defenses has come up. I mean, it's not a secret. It's been published that Israel's attack on Iran on October 26th went through Syria. So I'm curious if you feel there's a way to finesse some of these issues of air defenses. I mean, in the case of Russia, am I right that Russia kept the S-300s like under lock and key, didn't turn them over to Syria? Am I right?
Yes, I think we need to ask, why does Syria need air defenses? Who is the possible enemies by air? You would find that it's only Israel. So we should address why Israel is using its air force in Syria.
Yeah.
And Israel will do well to exploit all other alternatives. And Turkey would be wise not to tread on this tripwire, because that's something that makes Israel tick.
Right. Right. So, Nair, what do you think? What you heard from Assaf?
So clearly, I think that President Erdogan's rhetoric, calling for destruction of Israel is unacceptable. But I also think that you can see Erdogan as two personalities. It's Erdogan the populist and Erdogan the realist. And he's capable of 180s, does it all the time at home in foreign policy. I think one lesson Erdogan drew from the Mavi Marmara flotilla incident, after which Turkish-Israeli ties were ruptured for about a decade, is that never rupture with Israel again. Because you can't be a Middle East player if you're not talking to everyone. You can't be a global player if you don't have channels to all the players. And so clearly, I think when his populist rhetoric is out there, it's more for domestic consumption. Erdogan has a conservative right-wing base in Turkey. Economy is not doing very well. He's trying to mobilize his base through culture wars. And Israel sometimes comes in handy, sadly. Erdogan, the realist, is a very different political actor. I think he's looking at this, and that's why Turkey has agreed to deconfliction mechanisms, as reported in media, trying to find a way to have a modus vivendi with Israel. I can see how Israelis see the missile defense systems or air defense systems as a red line. But I actually think that Turkey and Israel have a joint interest in stabilizing Syria, although in the short term that might look antithetical to some of the Israeli goals. Because if Syria descends into another round of civil war, it will invite Iran back. That's neither in Israel's interest, nor in Turkey's interest, nor in US interests. And I think it's also a way to isolate Russia's influence. Russia has not completely exited the country, unlike Iran. Russia still has some bases in the north. And if Syria descends into another round of civil war, Russian influence will be expanded in that country. U.S. role will be significant because U.S. military can arrange for deconfliction mechanisms. And beyond that, I think also politically, the U.S. would have to come in. I can actually see a sort of a Camp David format where Trump brings Erdogan and Netanyahu maybe in a virtual summit where they shake hands, not perhaps smiling, but it will be Cold War like Camp David was, where the two countries agree that they have become de facto neighbors through Turkish presence in Syria, but also that they're going to guard each other's core security interests. And that, I think, first of all, goes through stabilizing Syria, because a weak Syria that is always at the precipice of civil war invites Iran and Russia back, and especially given Trump administration's priorities regarding Iran, that's completely unwanted, of course, from the perspective of U.S. interests.
So, Nir, to follow up, do you fear that, look, I think where Israel's sitting is the fear of the Islamists after October 7th. It was there before October 7th, but it's certainly been inflamed since October 7th. Can you understand, if suddenly Erdogan was saying, look, we don't want this to be a classic Muslim Brotherhood state. Israel has its suspicions about Erdogan personally. That's part of the problem. For Israel, he's not the ideal messenger. But on the other hand, it's not just Israel. There's the issue of Jordan next door.
Sure.
Can you imagine a Turkey that says, look, I know what the Israelis are worried about. We're not looking to go to war with them. And B, we're not ideologically out to inflame a regime, by the way, that, Shara coming from ISIS, Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda roots, that why Israel has its fears. Are there things ideologically that could address this? Are there external actors? A Lebanese friend is convinced, an analyst friend is convinced that MBS has been talking to Erdogan about this very point, about the concern about using Syria as a launch pad for a more, for ideological opposition to Israel. Is there something that Turkey can address in your view?
Yeah, I think that Turkey can has some leverage over HTS. So HTS is not a Turkish client. It had some Turkish support in the past, but Turkey's ideal proxy and real proxy in Syria was Syrian National Army, which is still backed by Turkey and hasn't completely folded under the HTS government. But Turkey has some leverage on HTS because Turkey, bordering Syria, is a NATO ally. President Erdogan is expected to visit Washington and see President Trump, and I think they'll have a grand bargain conversation on Syria. I think that HTS knows that sanctions against Syria will be lifted. The international community will engage the new government in Damascus, and the HTS will gain legitimacy only through Turkish mediation. If Turkey is not in the game, none of these things are happening, and that's Turkey's leverage over HTS, and thus US's leverage over HTS. I think these instruments of lifting sanctions and engaging and recognizing the government internationally are all carrots. They should be given out sparingly. And I think that the conversation that Erdogan will have with Trump here should have some kind of starting points, one of which is that Syria will never be a source of jihadist attacks against US and its allies, that includes Israel, and that the government will completely destroy its chemical weapons and other weapons of mass destruction programs, and that, of course, it will be inclusive of Syria's diversity, as well as normalizing relations with all its neighbors. I also think that just as the Israelis vindicated because they have won wars against Hamas and Hezbollah and kicked Iran out of the region as a secondary effect. Turkey also feels vindicated because, like it basically took Damascus through a proxy that fell on its lap, and Turkey has kind of become a power, hard power wielding middle power. It has defeated Russia and its proxies, not just in Syria, but in Libya and South Caucasus. So elites feel like this is Turkey's time. And in Israel, I think it looks like elites feel like this is Israel's time, which is why I think it's so hard for the two countries right now to say, let's just come down to reality. And that's why I think US role is so significant. I think there'll be two levels. One is military to military confidence building measures, which is probably already happening given that we are seeing de-escalatory steps. And the other one has to be political, which is where I think it has to be at the level of presidents starting the dialogue. That I think will kind of go across the society and the bureaucracies. First, telling the bureaucracies, we're not on a war path, we're on a de-escalation path. So figure out your problems, and it could also include Turkey, of course, at some point, lifting sanctions on Israel and also reinstating ambassadors. Ambassadors were never officially kicked out after the Gaza war, but Israel called its ambassador back from Ankara, so diplomatic channels have to be opened up. So a lot of work needs to be done. But I think the good news is that we have probably avoided direct military confrontation after the events of last week. But there's still a lot of work to be done, which is whether it's spheres of influence or can or should Turkey bring air defense systems, and also if the two countries can establish really high levels of communication. I think it will have foreign ministers, intelligence chiefs, and presidents talking to each other, and also technical committees doing deconflicting on a day-by-day basis.
Are you optimistic, given what Soner just said, Assaf? Do you think, Israel has its intelligence channels with Turkey, as poor as things are with Erdogan and Netanyahu. Are you optimistic that deconfliction, they will find a way because they have a convergence of interest? Neither of them want war with the other. Do you see this as something that can work? As Soner mentioned, carrots here too that could play a role. That there's the Trump's personal relationship each with Erdogan and Netanyahu. How optimistic are you that deconfliction can happen?
Practically, it can happen. On the tactical level, it can happen easier than on the strategic level. On the undisclosed and quiet level, it's easier. Even with the Shah regime, I wouldn't be surprised if there are already channels of communication, because this is how the region works, and you want to be able to communicate. We have a lot of interest that can be served by such dialogue, both with Turkey and with Syria. Soner mentioned chemical weapons, Captagon, smuggling to Lebanon, making sure that Iran and Hezbollah do not return. All of these are optimistic in this sense. Syria can tell officially, well, Shabaa Farms, that the Lebanese call, is actually Syrian turf, and in this way deprive Hezbollah of its greatest, pretext in that sense. Israel wants safety for the Druze. Israel may be a possible supplier of gas. So there's a lot to discuss here. Now the wisdom would be how to find the space and do it, recalling that our topmost problem is Iran these days, definitely this year, and Gaza is still ongoing. So the strain on the IDF is quite high. And I don't see Israel looking for extra trouble beyond what it deems safe now. So I think there is a chance, but in the Middle East, the fact that there is a chance doesn't mean that they won't miss it.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just pick up on something, because it affects both of you, is the issue of minorities, and that in the case of Turkey, there's the issue of the Kurds, and the case of Israel in the southern part of Syria, there's the Druze. And I'm trying to think, are these going to be bridges or are they minefields? In other words, maybe I'll start with you on this one, Assaf, is that the Druze, Israel has made statements about the southern Druze. It's also made statements about a no-go zone for the Syrian army in places like Netanyahu has, in places like Quneitra, Dara, Suwaida. Do you and as ultimate, as cultivated the Druze? I understand there's been some blowback in terms of some anti-Israel activity among some parts of the population in southern Syria, and people don't want a bear hug, of course. They might want to work with Israel, but they don't want to be called like fifth columnists and the like. So I'm just trying to think, how does Israel navigate beyond the issue of Turkey and deconfliction? How does it navigate the southern part and with the minorities and the issue of the Kurdish issue for Turkey has been such a massive issue for the Turks, and Israel's had its own relations with the Kurds, but I'm curious how you each see it in terms of how the minorities, could that be a bridge in bringing the sides together, Israel and Syria, and Israel and Turkey? How do you, or is it going to be more of a problem, more of a headache than anything else? But so I mean, Assaf.
Well, it depends what we do with it. If we state, in public that the Druze militia will be like the South Lebanon army, I would say that's not the step in the right direction. If we state that Jarmana, almost in Damascus, is the place where we won't let the regime attack the Druze, and the Druze themselves say, we don't need Israel in that. That's probably a public misstep. If you quietly arrange for logistics and supplies and so on, and let the Israeli Druze meet their brothers on the other side, that's, I think, much more advisable. But we also need to remember two main things. One is Israeli politics, because much of this orchestra has been playing to the Israeli politics side of the fence. And another is our Lebanese experience. We don't want, in a sectorial or sectarian country, to be drawn as the proxy army of some of the Maronites or the Druze or any other one. And Israel doesn't spend enough time on learning its neighbors' internal politics to be a real high-level player on that. I think that's the word of caution.
So, first of all, I was kind of struck by Assad's answer to your earlier question about how Israel is tired on these different fronts, Gaza, Hezbollah, and maybe it doesn't want to open another one. So I think that while it can be said that Israel is not interested in full-scale military conflict with Turkey, Turkey is even less interested. Fidan and others have given commentary, suggesting that Turkey is open to a deal in Syria. So I guess one part of the deal is, how do you bring these kind of minority groups under central government rule? In this regard, the most significant one for Turkey is the Kurds in the east, because of the fact that the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces here, of which the Kurdish People's Protection Forces, YPG, the core element, is an irritant issue in US-Turkish ties, actually more than an irritant issue. And it has to do with the fact that the YPG is linked to the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party, a terror-designated entity. Turkey is in talks with the PKK indirectly for the group to disarm. PKK's jail leader, Öcalan, made a call for the group to disarm, and YPG and SDF have said that they will follow this call. I think this came after a visit by CENTCOM Commander Kurula to the region, where he met SDF officials and probably told them, look, we're going to leave Syria. You're on your own. Either have a deal with Damascus or Turkey will come in. And it looks like the SDF is agreeing to go under Damascus. But now that seems to be on hold while the SDF committed to move in, because maybe SDF is realizing that Syria is not going to centralize so fast. These centrifugal forces, Druze and Alawites on the coast and Kurds in the east, might stay in place. I think that ultimately the vision for the inclusion of the Kurds is through political participation, which also tracks, I think, how in Turkey Erdogan wants to address the PKK problem. Once the PKK disarms and withdraws all its fighters and members out of Turkey and stops carrying out terror attacks, the idea is that the pro-Kurdish Dem Party, which participates in elections, would see its mayors, elected mayors, reinstated. I think Turkey wants a kind of a similar path, and maybe that's how the HTS vision is, for the inclusion of Syrian Kurds. They would have their own political party. They would run in elections. If they win the mayorship of a Kurdish city, then it's theirs to run. If they lose it to an Arab or Syriac, then it's theirs to run. So not territorial autonomy, but political participation through, especially through local elections and local government. We're not there yet. Maybe that's another area where Turkey and Israel can talk about kind of how Syria's centralization would work, because I feel like the YPG feels that maybe it doesn't have to rush in to fold under Damascus because Syria is not re-centralizing so fast. So an interesting question I have is, and maybe Assaf can respond, is how, news reports that Israel has now contacted the YPG. To me, this is like the mirror image of Turkish support to Hamas. So if you take a dispassionate view of the region, Hamas is Israel's mortal enemy. Turkey supports it. YPG is Turkey's mortal enemy. Israelis are in touch with it. Of course, the Turkish-Hamas relationship is deeper. It's 2-decade old. Turkey hosted Hamas's political leadership. Israel is not hosting YPG's leadership, but it's in contacts with it. I wonder if there's a trade-off there to be made at some point in the future where the two countries can commit to ending any kind of contacts with the group that the other side considers a mortal threat as a way to move forward.
You think Erdogan would do it with Hamas?
It would be a very, that was I'm going to say, it would be a very long bridge for Erdogan to jump over. I think that's one area where Erdogan's kind of pragmatic side really has limitations. But he's also a politician. For him, I think things such as having a really good tie with the US president, carry, and we know Trump's views of Hamas. Who knows? It all depends on, I think, if Syria is on a de-escalatory path or we see further escalation. If we see further escalation, I think you can write off these Hamas YPG trade-off scenario completely. But if you see a de-escalatory path continuing, especially with Trump playing a central role, it's something that you could, at some point, I think, reel Erdogan in. Again, it's a very long-term vision, but.
Assaf, how realistic?
Long-term.
Yeah.
After a lot of trust building, after common success stories, after being able to agree to easier issues, because surely Turkey's and Erdogan's support of Hamas is not a technical issue. It's a deep identity issue. It's an ideological issue, and it's a great banner of supporting the Palestinian cause in a way. So I think that's as we have in other contexts, we have core issues and more peripheral. Let's start with the peripheral, which are more technically addressable, and I think there is the potential.
Well, this was great because I think you guys really helped flesh out what are the minefields that these two countries face and as they navigate Syria, and what is could be more doable in the shorter term, and one is more aspirational over time. But I think this has been very insightful to me to really understanding this new complex situation that everyone's suddenly in after the fall of the Assad regime. So I really want to thank you both, Soner, Cagaptay, and Assaf Orion for really enlightening us, and to all of our listeners and viewers, and stick with the Washington Institute and future policy forums. I hope you enjoyed the one today, the 2 parts, and wishing you all good day. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.